Okay, so we're going to talk about Chapter 9, okay, which is the skeletal muscle tissues. Chapter 10, we'll talk about more of the detailed individual muscles. So muscle tissue, of course, makes up 40 to 50%, of course, of your total body adult weight, and that, of course, is in an average adult person. So the bones are going to provide leverage and form a framework of the body. They cannot move body parts by themselves, so motion results from the alternating contracting and relaxation of the muscles. So they, of course, along with the skeletal system, move the body. Myology, of course, is a scientific study of muscles. We will talk about three types of muscle tissues. That's the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and the skeletal muscle. We talked about those three previously in Chapter 4, and we'll review those again in this chapter since we're talking about the muscular system. So, smooth muscle is the first one. Of course, it makes up the walls of the hollow organs, um, such as your respiratory passageways. Other examples would be your muscles, of course, that focus on the eye lenses. Also, another example would be walls of the arteries and the veins. And another example of a muscle we've already talked about in the skin, in the integumentary system, was the erector pili muscle. Okay. So these muscles are involuntary movement, which means they most cannot be consciously controlled. So next, the cell structure. So if you look at your picture of the smooth muscle, uh, it kind of looks like it has a belly here. Okay, and then it gets smaller on the ends, and that's where they call the tapered end. So it does have tapered ends. It has one single central nucleus per each cell. Okay, there's no visible bands or striations, so that's how it gets its name. Of course, it's smooth, has a smooth appearance when you look at it through a light microscope, so it's called smooth muscle because you see no visible striations. It is stimulated, of course, by nerve impulses, and those nerve impulses are going to be regulated by your autonomic nervous system, which is your ANS. Also regulated, of course, or stimulated by hormones, and it's also stimulated, of course, by stretching. Cardiac muscle, of course, this is only found in the heart. Okay, so it makes up the wall of the heart. It does have involuntary movement, so it cannot be consciously controlled. The heart beats because it has a pacemaker. Of course, it's going to initiate those contractions of the heart. And if you're unaware, of course, a pacemaker is a built-in rhythm, which is also termed autorhythmicity. Membranes, of course, are, if you look at the cell structure first, okay, and we're just looking at the drawing here. You have, of course, a single central nucleus, of course, within each cell. It is striated. Okay, so you have these visible lines of the light and dark bands. And then you also have these dark lines, of course, on the picture. Those dark lines are intercalated discs. Okay, those intercalated discs, what they do is they just connect the ends of the cardiac muscle fibers to one another. So it's also going to allow, because they connect to one another, it's going to allow the muscle action potentials to spread from one cardiac muscle fiber to another. These, of course, are going to be stimulated by electrical impulses, the nervous stimuli, and hormones. Attached, of course, the skeletal muscles, they're going to be the muscles that are attached to the bones, the muscles, or the skin. It does have a voluntary movement, except all of these have voluntary movement except for the diaphragm muscle. Sorry, I'm running out of room. So the diaphragm muscle is your main breathing muscle. You don't want to stop breathing. So that one is actually involuntary, but all the other skeletal muscles are voluntary. So you can consciously control those except for the diaphragm. So the cell structure is they're long, like little columns here, cylindrical. They have multiple nucleuses per cell, so you'll see multiple nuclei per each cell. So these are going to be heavily striated. So if you look, you see a lot of these dark bands or dark lines, of course, on the picture. So when you look through a light microscope, you'll see these heavily striated, alternating light and dark bands. It is stimulated, of course, by the nervous system, and it's, of course, stimulated, of course, by your somatic division of the nervous system, and it's involuntary. Um, Next, of course, the skeletal muscle has four primary functions. If you read through different lecture books, you will see some will have maybe 6 or 8 functions, but these are what we refer to as the primary functions. And within these, we could break it down into a little bit more detailed ones. But we're going to give you the basic ones first. Okay, so the first one is will be your skeletal movement. This one's obvious. It's walking, running, grasping a pencil, picking up objects, things like that. Posture maintenance. This is, of course, the skeletal muscle contractions are going to help stabilize the joints in the body and also help to maintain your posture. Also going to allow you to produce heat, so heat generation. So when the muscle contracts, it produces heat, which is also going to help to maintain your normal body temperature, and that's also known as thermogenesis. Storing, of course, and moving substances within the body. So smooth muscles are going to move your food substances through the GI tract. Also, it's going to help prevent outflow of contents of the hollow organs as well too. Connective tissue, of course, the subcutaneous layer, or called the hypodermis layer. It separates, of course, your muscle from the skin. It is composed of areolar connective tissue and adipose tissue. So the main function, of course, of the connective tissue is it's going to provide a pathway for nerves, blood vessels, and the lymphatic vessels, of course, to enter and exit the muscles. So make sure that you add that to your list or to your PowerPoint slide. It does provide a pathway for nerves, blood vessels, and the lymphatic vessels to enter and exit the muscles. Your adipose tissue, of course, stores most of the body's triglycerides, serves as an insulated layer. That insulating layer, of course, is going to help to reduce heat loss, so you don't have too much heat loss, and protect muscles, of course, from physical trauma as well, too. To understand, of course, how contractions of the skeletal muscles can generate tension, you must first understand like the gross and the microscopic anatomy of the muscle fibers or the muscle tissue. So we start with talking about fascia. That's just a dense sheet of broad band of irregular connective tissue, of course, and what it does, it lines the body while in the limbs. So it's going to support and surround the muscles and other organs, of course, of the body. Holds the muscles together. It allows free movement, carries nerves, blood vessels, of course, lymphatic vessels, and fills, of course, spaces between the muscles. Structure of a muscle, the connective tissue layers, these are going to surround and protect the muscular tissue. So if you look here at the picture, this one little piece here is a muscle fiber. This little tiny, it looks like a little straw sticking up, but that is an actual muscle fiber cell. So around that individual fiber, you have the layer, the endomysium layer. Okay, then you have a lot of these muscle fibers together, or then are going to be wrapped around another muscle fascicle, another muscle tissue layer, and that's called a muscle fascicle when you have several muscle fibers surrounded by a connective tissue layer. Okay, that connective tissue layer is called your perimysium. So the perimysium, of course, surrounds the muscle fascicles, which are bundles of muscle fibers. Okay, then you have these bundles of muscle fibers. Yeah, then you have several bundles. So if you look here on your picture, you have several little bundles. I'm kind of circling them here. Okay, those bundle fibers are going to be covered by a connective tissue as well too, and that one, of course, is your epimysium, and it covers the entire muscle part of the deep fascia. Okay, so just remember, of course, this one is the inner layer. The perimysium, of course, is going to be the middle layer. And the epimysium, of course, is going to be the outer one. It's going to cover the whole muscle. Okay. But just remember, around the fascicles. Fascicles, of course, is what, just kind of backtrack a little bit here. Fascicles is what gives a meat or a cut of meat is characteristic, what we call the grain. So if you tear a piece of meat, it rips apart, of course, along those fascicles. So tendon, this attaches muscle to bone, and you do need to know one particular tendon, and that, of course, is called, for right now. We'll add more on later. But Achilles tendon, make sure you write that one down. What you need to know about the Achilles tendon, of course, it is the strongest tendon in the body. It attaches your gastrocnemius, of course, to your calcaneus bone. So it attaches the gastrocnemius muscle, which is your calf muscle, to the calcaneus bone. And the calcaneus bone, of course, is your heel bone. Aponeurosis, of course, that is when the tendon extends as a broad, flat layer. The tendon is will be called aponeurosis. We have, of course, one example of an aponeurosis is there's one on top of the skull, and it is between the frontalis and the occipital talus. Your tendon sheaths, of course, these are tendons of the wrist and the ankle, are going to be enclosed by tubes of fibrous connective tissue. And those joints, of course, can slide back and forth, so it helps to reduce that friction as those tendons slide back and forth. Tendon aponeurosis, of course, is dense, regular connective tissue, which is going to be composed of collagen fibers. Next, the number of skeletal muscle fibers is determined, of course, before you are born. Most are going to last a lifetime. Two terms you need to know. One is, of course, your hypertrophy. That is when you have dramatic muscle growth that occurs after birth occurs, and you have enlargement of existing muscles. Hyperplasia, that is an increase in the number of fibers. So both of these, of course, are going to be affected, of course, by the human growth hormone and, of course, a few other hormones. But the one we concentrate on right now is the human growth hormone is known as HGH. What HGH can do is it can increase the size of the muscle fibers. And one example of a particular HGH hormone is the testosterone. Number one here, during childhood, what hormones promote further enlargement of your skeletal muscle fibers? And again, that is your human growth hormone, HGH. And of course, if you want put more specific, it'd be the testosterone. Testosterone, of course, is a HGH hormone. HGH testosterone, of course, comes from both the testes in the males, a lot of it there, and then, of course, a little comes from the ovaries in the females. Fibrosis, of course, that is the replacement of muscle fibers by fibrous scar tissue. And it can only regulate, of course, to a limited extent. Okay, next we have your sarcolemia. That is a plasma membrane, of course, of a muscle cell. Sarcoplasm, of course, is the cytoplasm of a muscle fiber. It contains a large amount of glycogen. When glycogen, of course, is going to be used for synthesis of your ATP. So if you remember back when we talked about the cell chapter, we talked about cytoplasm. Both of these have plasm in them, so you can kind of, it helps you to remember those. And sarco, both of these is going to refer to the muscles. Lemia, of course, that's just one that you have to remember for the plasma membrane. Next, we have a picture here. It shows you again those layers. But again, and then I'm going to add on one more because we already talked about myofibrils. So remember what I told you that last picture? I said this one looks like a straw. That was the muscle fiber. So this is the straw, which is the muscle fiber. It is surrounded, of course, by your endomysium. Then you have, of course, a bunch of those muscle fibers make up a fascicle. And it surrounds it here and tells you that's a fascicle here. But it's, of course, surrounded by the middle layer, which is the perimysium. And then you have bundles of fascicles here. Those bundles of fascicles, of course, are going to be surrounded, of course, by the epimysium. But one thing to know is if you look at the individual muscle fiber, we have this another one that's coming out of it, and it's called a myofibril. So I wanted to kind of point that out because we're going to talk about it on the next slide. And the myofibril is just a thread-like structure uh, that's going to be located in that sarcoplasm, and it's a contractile organelle. So next we're going to talk about here the myoglobin. The myoglobin, of course, is a protein. It is a red protein that's only found in muscles. It's going to bind the oxygen molecules, of course, that diffuse into the muscle fibers from the interstitial fluid. What it does is it releases oxygen when it is needed, of course, for the ATP production. So that's the function of it. Myofibrils, I just showed you a picture of that one on the previous slide. They are small thread-like structures located in the sarcoplasm, and what they're going to do is they're going to extend to the entire length of the actual muscle fiber. So their striations, of course, make the entire skeletal muscle fiber appear striated. So it is a contractile organelle of the skeletal muscle. Okay, a couple review questions here. Blank, of course, is wasting away of the muscles because of progressive loss of myofibrils. That is going to be, of course, your muscular atrophy. True or false, it can occur because muscles are not being used. True. Next we have blank is an increase in the diameter of the muscle fibers due to increased production of myofibrils and other organelles. It results from forceful repetitive muscular activity such as strength training, and that's going to be your muscular hypertrophy. Okay, so this will be the end of part 1.